As a child, I would watch high school dramas and teen comedies and never feel as though I were fully enjoying them, for a single reason. I just wasn't old enough. I wasn't a high school teenager, and I figured that until I reached the age of these characters, I would never truly understand these films. As time progressed, the anticipation grew, and when I finally reached the age of all these characters I loved so much, something didn't feel right. What I'd expected was to feel as though I were looking into a window and watching my peers interact with each other, but what I discovered a lot of the time were unnatural recreations of the world. Maybe the characters were too old or the dialogue was unnatural, but the thing that struck me was that these films were so close to being what I had envisioned, so close to 100% perfect recreations, but had usually only a single flaw that struck me with a feeling of discomfort. And that was when I realized that I was experiencing an extended effect of the uncanny valley. For those who don't know, the uncanny valley is the idea that a human replica that looks almost completely like, but ever so slightly unlike, a real human will arouse a feeling of unease in a person. This is the reason why the animation in The Polar Express and The Adventures of Tintin make me uncomfortable. But the theory extends beyond just human aesthetic, transcends visuals themselves, and can be applied to a film as a whole. Let's take a recent example and try to explain this. Story time. About 6 months ago, give or take, I went to see a pretty great film in theaters, and one of the previews was for a film called The Edge of 17. The general consensus between me and my girlfriend was that this film looks terrible. But then something happened. The film was released, and out of nowhere, Chris Stuckman was praising it, Scott Derrickson was tweeting about it, Rotten Tomatoes was certifying it fresh with an astonishing 95%. Sold on the film, I decided to check it out, keeping in mind some of the things said about it.
They say shit that high schoolers say.
And what do you know? I found myself stuck, once again, in the uncanny valley. It was almost great. I give it like a 6. It's pretty relatable and presented some good ideas, but the dialogue was on a 13 Reasons Why level of forced wit.
You're an actual nerd, aren't you?
My entire generation is a bunch of mouth breathers. They literally have a seizure if you take their phone away for a second.
That I, as a teenager, know is not 100% authentic. That was when I stumbled upon a conclusion. Out of all these critics and myself, the one person who didn't like The Edge of 17 was the one person who was actually 17. That was a conclusion, but the real conclusion was drawn from this realization. And that is that, in order for a film to appear more realistic, one of two criteria must be met. It must, in some aspects, intentionally depict events with relative inaccuracy, or the audience must possess a level of detachment from, or lack in-depth knowledge of, the material at hand. To illustrate this concept, consider the difference between a detailed portrait and a cartoon. While perfect sketches exist and truly capture the human essence, a vast majority of these attempts come close without fully capturing every minute detail, and as a result, the portrait looks wrong and somewhat eerie, like a Chuck E. Cheese photo booth. When you go from this level of detail in a drawing to a cartoon character, it feels more comfortable, as though the image is suddenly correct. Scribbles for pupils simply look right on a person with a round nub for a nose, whereas a perfectly drawn face is ruined by a pupil being just a millimeter off. It's like dropping a blue marble in a pile of red marbles, as opposed to a pile of blue marbles. And the same goes for a red marble in a blue pile. A realistic feature on an unrealistic drawing also stands out. That said, this cartoon character must still resemble what it's intended to be. A human must still possess human body parts. A pile of blue marbles, a pile of red marbles, and a mixed pile of marbles are still, above all else, piles of marbles. So what does this mean, and how does it explain why adults like the teen movie more than a teen? Well, adults today are not teenagers today, obviously. They can never be teenagers today, therefore, they will never know what a teenager today is completely like, as far as the details go, vernacular and mannerisms and whatnot. But as long as a film can hit the general aspects of teenagers applicable to any era, the film will still resemble an accurate vignette of teenage life. These aspects are the equivalent to the necessary anatomical features of a cartoon character. Rick Sanchez still needs a head and eyes and a mouth and limbs. The aforementioned details of teenage life are the equivalent of the realism of these features, and they must remain consistent among each other. Once again, a beautiful sketch with a few inaccurate details looks wrong, just as a relatable teenage situation with inaccurate dialogue feels wrong. I, as a teenager, know what these details are supposed to look like these days. These adults, incapable of knowing 100%, are blind to the details, and as a result, they are left to focus on the general aspects, which, if correct, and in this case are, culminate into a good film in their minds. I love the film Heathers. It has great social commentary, portrayals of archetypes we've all been familiar with in high school, and all of the general facets of teenage life, with, a bit of a twist, and an incredibly intriguing plot. The reason I love it is that because it's a film from a decade I didn't live through, about a situation I've never been in, I can take all this in without getting caught up in the minutia. I don't know what high school in the 80s was like. For all I know, these could be authentic interactions, but if they weren't, I wouldn't know the difference. And more importantly, I don't know what it's like to kill somebody. I'm completely oblivious to the details that would and should occur in this film, and because the general anatomical features of this cartoon character are present, I buy into it and am subjected to complete suspension of disbelief. The overall comedic tone of the film definitely contributes to this, but that's really just icing on the cake. If the film were a straight-faced satire, I would still love it. As you could probably guess, this idea applies to far more than just teen dramas. Take war films, for instance. Critics and movie buffs everywhere consider Full Metal Jacket a masterpiece, and rightly so. It is a phenomenal film with incredible depth. However, Vietnam veterans often think otherwise. The first half of this film is the equivalent of one of those rare perfect sketches. It gets every detail right, to the point where people almost stopped watching because they were so accurately taken back to their time as a soldier. But when the second half rolls around, the film loses just a fraction of its realism. And like a hairline fracture in a windshield, this shattered the realism presented in the first half, at least in these veterans' minds. If you care about film, then you probably already knew this. It's not exactly movie trivia. However, what's been lacking is an explanation for why so many of us feel differently. And that's because we simply don't know the details of what it was actually like in Vietnam. We don't know that the events of the second and third act are any less likely to occur than the events of the first act, so we go along with it. The Hurt Locker is often regarded as the most realistic war film ever made, but according to an actual service member who served in Iraq,
The Hurt Locker likes to pretend to be realistic. What follows is possibly the most blatant disregarding of the Uniform Code of Military Justice that I've seen in a movie that isn't about Vietnam. Violating safety regulations for a pair of easily replaceable gloves doesn't make you a badass. It makes you... what's the word? A tool bag idiot.
the people who gave this film a 98% on Rotten Tomatoes and awarded it Best Picture were not soldiers, and therefore they were blind to the inaccurate details, and as a result, ignorance was bliss, and they were catapulted out of the uncanny valley. Sometimes accuracy is not the best idea in the filmmaking process and can actually take the audience out of the film, a piece of art whose main focus should be immersion. When a film achieves something just short of perfect, it's often worse than something far further from perfect, just as a silver medalist is often far more upset he didn't win gold than a bronze medalist. Because we as humans can't help but to get muddled up in the details, the solution is often to simply step back and see the big picture the way it was meant to be seen. Thank you.